Greetings, fellow adventurers. I am the Medieval Nerd, and welcome to part 2 of the tutorial series for Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead. If you haven't watched part 1, I highly recommend you do. Link in the description below. Today we're going to be focusing on options, world generation, and character creation. So to navigate the beautiful options here, we're going to use the arrow keys left and right. As so. First thing that we will do is change the game's resolution and set it to borderless windowed mode. You'll be consulting the wiki and other sites a lot, so I highly recommend that you pick this option. So, under options, we're going to go ahead and move over to the graphics section, and to do that we're going to be using the bigger and smaller than keys by holding down shift, comma, or shift period, as so. Okay, and then we're going to scroll down to terminal width and height. If you have a 1080p monitor, you're going to want to set it to 1920 and width and 1080 in height, but there's a little twist here. So if I'm not mistaken, 240 is 1920. Here we go. Obviously, if you have a smaller monitor resolution, set it to whatever suits your monitor. And here the thing for 1080 is that, whoa, kind of monitor. Alright, see, you can't get 1080, so we're going to pick just a little bit lower, which is 1072. Good enough. And then we're going to go over to full screen and pick a windowed borderless. This escape, you have to do shift Y, because it's capital Y, not small y. Very important. Now we're going to quit the game, bring back the launcher. And if we did everything right, should be in borderless full screen. There we go. And what does the survey say? Victory! Alright, now that we don't need a magnifying glass to see the game screen, let's go over and tweak a few other settings. So open up options, and under the general tab, scroll all the way to the bottom and change sound pack to chest hole. Next, we're going to move over to interface, and this is more a question of preference, depending on how you like to see values in terms of temperature, speed, mass, and time. I'm Canadian, so I love to mix my imperial and my metric, Celsius, kilometers, pounds, and a 12-hour format. That's how I like it. Next tab we're going to go to is the world defaults. This tab is for changing the basic settings of world generation. I suggest tweaking any preference here, or else you'll have to set them every time you create a new world. And also I suggest that you go over them once you're more familiar with the game, because some of these settings might not mean much to you. Things like season length will definitely be something most people like to tweak. I for one like to put it to 90 days. So every season lasts 90 days, making it roughly 360 days for a game year. I'm nerdy like that. But preferences aside, there's a few suggestions I have for newcomers. So, considering monsters/mobs, I would suggest set the following, which would be static and wonder spawns. I would suggest leaving it to true and false. This will make it so that monsters spawn in static locations and will not move around the map. For simplicity's sake, this is to avoid waking up one day and having an army of zombies in front of your door. Next, we'll move over to quote-unquote human NPCs, and that would be static and random NPCs. At best, I'd suggest putting static NPCs at true if you want a taste of dealing with their AI. It can be both interesting and frustrating, but I'll go over the particulars of that in another video. Lastly are the experimental Z settings. Although still highly in development, I suggest putting both of them on. So everything is set, we're done. I'm going to press escape, shift Y to save. And that covers the basic options of the game. Now we'll move over to world creation, since before you can actually make a character, you need to have a world to create him in. So now that we have all our settings set up, we're going to go over to the world creation, create world. And in this section, to move between the tabs of the mod list, you're going to press the tab key, as such. So in this list, I'll be basically adding most of the mods that add content, but don't mess with the game's balance too much. So under item additions mods, we're going to add Ice Coon's weapons pack, medieval and historic content, more survival weapons, more locations, tall buildings, boats, folding parts pack, vehicle additions pack, and if you're a fan of fantasy, go ahead and add arcane and magic items. With this set of mods, you'll have tons of types of guns, ammo, vehicles, locations, specialized tools, etc. Let's just say you'll have lots of toys to play with. Now, in terms of blacklist and balance, since this game has a really steep learning curve, I would highly recommend that you go for a Romero-style zombies for your first games. There will be other types of creatures, don't worry, but since zombies are the most prevalent, curtailing the variety and limiting them to slow-moving, brain-munching enemies is advisable. So, if you're on board with this, go over to the blacklist section, and you're gonna pick mundane zombies. Next thing you're gonna want to do is go over to balance. Whoops, see, wrong key. Go over to balance and add slow zombies. So basically you're gonna have only classic, so to speak, zombies, and they'll be slow moving, Romero style, not 28 days later. If you were a fan of 28 Days Later, could easily change slow zombies to fast, but as I said, if this is your first time playing the game, go with this, it'll be easier to get into. Now, the other thing we're going to be adding, and this is something I discussed in the first video, is Stats Through Skills 4. This mod makes it so your character can gain attributes based on which skill he's using throughout the day. And now, actually, that covers everything, because if we use the bigger and smaller than keys, move over to World Gen, all of these options we've already changed in the options menu. If there's any last minute change you want to do, please go ahead to do them here, but remember to change them in the options, or every time you're going to make a world, you're going to have to tweak those settings. So if we're happy with everything that we've chosen, move over to confirmation, and here you can name your world. If you don't have inspiration, you can just press the star key, and it'll give it a name random. Quaker Town, okay? Here, Tara Hills, that sounds good. And if you press tab or bigger than, it'll ask you to confirm with Shift Y, and boom, your world is created. So that covers world creation. We are just a few steps away of jumping into the madness. Let's move over to character creation, shall we? Alright, now that we have a freshly made world, let's make a poor soul to throw into it. So under new game, go ahead and pick custom character. So the first points tab is where you'll pick the system that will govern your character creation process. Multiple pools and single pool is basically two different ways that your points can be calculated. For simplicity's sake, pick single pool, makes it way easier and less confusing. Freeform, on the other hand, that is sort of more for testing / debug because there's absolutely no restrictions. So once you've picked single pool, you can use the bigger and smaller keys to move over to scenario. The scenario tab is to pick what circumstances your character will be in at the start of the game. It will define your starting location, condition / health, and inventory. At first, make sure to avoid the challenge prefixed scenarios, as those are as described, challenging. A scenario I've grown fond of for getting back into the game is Mall Cop. You'll start in a huge super mall with a lot of varied shops, food, clothes, utilities. You start off also with a decent weapon, a baton, and also a flashlight. Sure, you'll have tons of zombies to fight off, but if you navigate the back hallways properly, it's easy to avoid them or pick them out slowly. If you get bored, switch it up and explore other options. They have from minor to major impacts on the initial starting phase of the game. Move over to Profession. Other scenarios would have different variations, but since we have Mall Cop, the only option is Mall Security. Move over to Traits. I won't go over each trait extensively, but to give you a rough explanation of the purpose of this tab, this is where you pick positive or negative traits for your character. The former costing points, the later granting points. For the purpose of this video, I will recommend one of each. The first, and this is quite good one for beginners, and that is Night Vision. By default, when in the dark, your character only sees one square ahead of him, making exploration and fleeing extremely difficult, see impossible. If you go for Mall Cop, since the vast majority of the mall is not lit, this will be beyond useful. The negative trait that I always pick is Heavy Sleeper. Not only does this give you some bonus points, but it also makes it so that your character won't wake up in the middle of the night because of a thunderstorm. Ideally, just go over all of these and pick what makes you feel good. And if you're not sure, leave that alone. Do a few games and you'll be like, oh, I want a quicker character, I want to be able to read books faster. Just go over the stats and it'll basically be a lot self-explanatory. Likewise for stats, a lot of these are self-explanatory with decent descriptions included. So just go through the list and read them. One thing I will say is for your first characters, feel free to leave them all at default. Once you're more familiar with the game, you'll be able to tweak them to fit your playstyle. If you are playing with stats through skills 4, as I suggested, you will actually be able to increase your stats based on which task your character performs throughout the day. Skills. This is where things get a little subjective and will highly depend on what you pick as playstyle. Do you want to find an RV and turn it into a mobile fortress? Do you want to turn yourself into a super mutant? It'll all depend on that. What I can offer in forms of advice is where not to spend your points. Take note that skills, even if they are at 0, can be learned either from books or through usage. For example, if you start shooting a bow, it'll raise your marksmanship and archery. A set of skills worth being stingy on points with are combat skills. You'll be fighting tons of zombies early on, so those skills will raise naturally. Driving is also another skill not worth investing in, since it goes up pretty fast the first time you drive your car. If you drive at reasonable speeds over roads, I've never actually gotten into any accidents. If anything, you might actually want to spend a bit more points in your traits, since those will last with you for the entire game, whereas skill points will just end up giving you a leg up at the start. So once you've picked up all your traits and whatnot, see, I've picked skills just for, end up this tutorial really fast, and then when you're done, and see, don't hold shift key too long because Windows gets upset. So once you've created your meat bag, give it a name or use star to call it whatever the game will, and once you're done you can press tab or bigger than, and are you finished? Yes, and voila. See, this might actually happen sometimes where the game is trying to find a location to put your character and has difficulty doing so in the world that we generated. If it does happen, just say try again, and most of the time after once or two tries your character will be where it's supposed to be. So this covers part 2 series of my setup of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead. Next videos will focus on survival tips and basic functionality. If you have any specific questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section. I am the Medieval Nerd. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, or comment. You were all amazing, and see you next time.